All right, so we're going to talk about the Watergate scandal and a little bit more broadly, kind of people's attitudes towards government in the 1970s and why that kind of changed. So the Watergate scandal is pretty famous. It involves Richard Nixon, but the roots of the Watergate scandal, are the feelings about government, I should say, begin in or I have the starting date of the Pentagon Papers in June 1971. This is not directly connected to Watergate, but it does deal with the idea of trust in government. Okay, so the Pentagon Papers were top secret classified documents that were written by various people in the government talking about the Vietnam War. And what it revealed was that the government knew that the Vietnam War was not really winnable, and yet they continued to be engaged in the Vietnam War anyway. And so these were actually released by a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, who released them to the public, even though they were top secret. And so these Pentagon Papers kind of revealed to everybody that kind of showed that credibility gap that we had talked about before, that the government knew the Vietnam War was not going well, but yet they still continued to go on fighting it. And so it made the government appear less trustworthy. And the result of this is that Nixon has a group of people called the plumbers. Their job was to kind of stop leaks. Get it? The whole meaning of plumbers, like, not with pipes, but leaks of information. And so they actually were spying on Daniel Ellsberg after that. So that's kind of where the roots of this kind of begin. So the Watergate scandal is really about an abuse of power by the president. And so it began with discovery of the break-in of the Democratic National headquarters. So these Washington Post reporters, they found out that the Democratic National headquarters was being broken into, and they were connecting the burglars to the Committee to Re-elect the President, sometimes called CREEP. Okay, and this led to Senate investigations about whether Nixon knew anything about this break-in or not. Okay. So these abuses of power by Nixon and his advisors were things like using an enemies list, so using government resources like the Internal Revenue Service for legal taxes to harass their opponents, to spy on journalists, and that sort of thing. The CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, they had plumbers to stop leaks, dirty tricks, basically trying to sabotage the other side of the election. Because the whole point here was that Nixon was running for re-election in 1972. So you also had the Watergate break-in in 1972, which is kind of the whole beginning point for the Watergate scandal. And it's called the Watergate Scandal because the break-in occurred at the Watergate office complex where the Democratic National headquarters was. Okay. And so then after that, it becomes a thing about the cover-up, Nixon administration covering up and blocking investigations. And the thing that people wanted to know is, what did the president know and when did he know it? So in other words, how involved was the president in things like the break-in, in this enemies list? How involved was the president? That was the kind of big question here. Now, at the time this is going on, the Vietnam War is still going on. One of the things that Nixon did that kind of feeds into this distrust is that he secretly bombed Cambodia, even though Congress had said you couldn't do that, and he did it anyway. And so Congress responded by trying to take back some of the power they'd given to the president with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And they passed the War Powers Act, which basically required the president to notify Congress within, I think, 48 hours of using military force. So Congress is already kind of not trusting Nixon because of the secret campaign to bomb Cambodia during the Vietnam War. Plus, now it's revealed that he's using these enemies lists and spying and all these kind of things on journalists and opponents and those kinds of things. So those things together don't lead to a lot of trust for Nixon. Okay, so in the investigation, what the Senate is investigating, they find out that the White House, Nixon, was taping conversations in the Oval Office, and so these taping of conversations made it kind of easy to figure out the answer to this question of what did the president know and when did he know it. But Nixon kind of refused to turn over the tapes. and Nixon was trying to block the investigation. In fact, there's something called the Saturday Night Massacre, which is not an actual massacre, but it's a massacre in terms of people's jobs. Nixon wants to fire the person who's investigating him, the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, but the Attorney General refuses and they resign. The next guy comes in, Nixon says, fire the special prosecutor. He refuses as well. Nixon fires him. And finally, the third guy ends up firing the special prosecutor. So again, it shows Nixon trying to block any kind of investigation here. And there are a lot of parallels to this, what's going on today or recently with President Trump and his impeachment in terms of firing people that are investigating him or that he feels are his opponents. So there is a Supreme Court case about these tapes that the White House was taping conversations. So Nixon refused to turn over the tapes, saying that it was top secret information and it would damage his ability as the president to engage in conversations about top secret things. And so it went to the court, and the Supreme Court decided that President Nixon had to turn over the tape to the investigators. And then once they did that, they turned over the tape and they started playing the tapes in these Senate investigations. And then all of a sudden there was like a mysterious 17-minute gap in the tapes where it was just nothing. And so that led to a lot of speculation that Nixon had tried to erase some of the more incriminating parts of the tapes. And at that point, the investigation was, it was clear that Nixon was going to be implicated somewhat in the crimes. And so John Dean, who worked for Nixon, he testified and he was able to link Nixon to the crimes, at least the cover up of the crimes anyway. Okay. And as a result, Nixon ended up resigning the presidency, and we have Gerald Ford becoming president. The result of all this is that people don't trust government anymore. They didn't trust the government with the secret bombing of Cambodia when that came out. The Pentagon Papers came out, and now the president is abusing his power by spying on people and organizing break-ins to his opponents, and it just looks real bad. And people are like, man, people in government are not trustworthy at all. Okay, so just a couple of other things that you should keep in mind here about the Watergate scandal. So when Nixon resigned, Nixon's vice president was a guy named Spiro Agnew, but he had already resigned previously to this because of a scandal about taxes. And so Ford was appointed from the House of Representatives to the vice presidency. So when Nixon resigned, his vice president was no longer there, and Ford becomes president. So it's kind of an unusual situation. I think also one of the things that's interesting here too is like this idea when the transcripts from the tapes were published in the newspapers would say expletive deleted every time the president or somebody cussed or whatever. And it kind of like made people feel kind of like gross about the presidency. Like it kind of tarnished the reputation of the presidency. Like the president wasn't acting with dignity they didn't see. And then that 18-minute gap of tape were erased. And so the question was like, was it accidental? Or was it on purpose? Was that where the kind of like smoking gun was, where Nixon would have admitted to everything? What was going on with the 18 minutes of tape? And so all these things look bad for Richard Nixon. And so Nixon resigns, and the country is in a really bad situation because also outside of all this stuff, the American economy is not very strong, right? There was an oil embargo, and so gas prices were very high. You had this inflation of prices, and the economy is not expanding very much. So all these things were happening to make the country kind of just feel like pretty terrible at that point. And so I have the ending date here of September of 1974, when Ford gives a full pardon to Nixon, because the president can offer pardons to crimes. And Ford says that our long national nightmare is over, and by pardoning Nixon, he was attempting to give closure to the country to kind of end this Watergate scandal and just kind of move on from it beyond. And Ford was heavily criticized for this decision. In fact, when he runs for election in 1976, he loses in large part because of that pardon. People did not think that was correct. They felt it showed that the president was above the law and that the laws didn't apply to him. However, I think in history, when we look back, Ford probably did the right thing to allow the country to kind of move on. Otherwise, we would have gone through the national trauma of a trial for the president, and maybe the president going to jail or something, and that would have been not good for the country to go through. So, I think over time, people's criticisms of Ford has softened a little bit, but at the time, Ford was heavily criticized, and in fact, lost the election in 1976 in part because of that. Also, because the economy was not very strong either, but that was a big part of it. His pardon of Nixon. So this kind of gets into the Watergate scandal. The big takeaway from the Watergate scandal is that people lost their trust in government. And you can point to the Watergate scandal and how Nixon acted with his enemies list. You can even point to the secret bombing of Cambodia that Nixon did too, as well as the Pentagon Papers. Those are all examples of things that cause people to lose their faith and trust in government. Okay. All right. So that kind of covers our Watergate scandal and a little bit more broadly the attitude of people in the 70s towards government.